Welcome to the Microsoft 365 Developer Podcast with your host, Jeremy Thake. Each week, you'll catch us speaking to expert developers about new tech, lessons learned, and opinions in this space. Okay, we're here again with Joey Glocke. Welcome back to the podcast, mate. It's been almost exactly a year since we got you on talking about this topic before.
I'm on an annual cadence. It's lovely to be back. Thanks for having me.
Just the reminder pinged up on my Outlook. Yeah. Like, best contact Joey for the latest updates on this product.
Yes, that's wonderful to have. It's good to be back. Enjoyed the conversation last time. Excited to talk about everything that's new and coming soon this time.
Yeah, and so for those that maybe aren't familiar with you, who is Joey Glocke? What do you do at Microsoft, and how long have you been there, and all that jazz?
Yeah, so I've been at Microsoft for about 11 years now, which is still wild to say out loud. Bounced around with a couple of different kind of enterprise areas and security areas, things like that, but eventually found my way to Teams, where I have been since 2018. And my team currently is kind of the extensibility product team for all things that happen in the flow of conversation. So that's chatbots. That's our new AI library that we're going to talk about kind of extensively on this show today. But it's also things like Teams messaging extensions, how links can unfurl in Teams, and how you can kind of make a good experience there. Adaptive cards, all that kind of stuff that happens in the flow of conversation is what my team works on.
That's awesome. And so, like 2018, so you've basically been around since the inception of the dev platform on Teams, I would imagine, right?
Yeah, I mean, and that's like, maybe a solid segue into talking about custom engine copilots that we're going to talk about today, which is, back then it was kind of before even the pandemic happened, and Teams itself was establishing its footing and finding, the right product market fit. And at the same time, we were building kind of these primitives of a platform. What are the different capabilities and components that can really unlock all the different unique places Teams offers, group chats, channels, meetings, live transcripts, things like that. So we started then in the bot space by just integrating Microsoft's bot framework. And that basically gave us kind of the primitives for a service or an entity that can talk to you in our Teams chats, basically in our Teams threads. So the idea being, what are the basic event handlers? What are the invoke patterns that make sense to run in Teams to just let an entity run there that you can talk to and it can talk back to you over time. So that was kind of our initial foray into bots. And for all intents and purposes, 2019, that range, that's really what bots could do. At that time, NLP, natural language processing, intent detection, and much less AI and large language models was very nascent, if not outright non-existing.
So you'd be typing the exact string of the command to trigger the bot framework to go down a certain path to actually work.
Pretty cumbersome, right? So it's like, to your point, you had to understand how to talk the bot's language as opposed to anything else. So we saw bots do a lot more kind of proactive things, basically send you notifications, let you know something changed in some service. Let's say you work in tech, you were doing a live site, might send you updates about that live site over time. So lots of good scenarios there. But then, as we all know, 2022 happens and ChatGPT kind of hits the zeitgeist. Everyone starts using it. And all of a sudden, there's this just new expectation of what these things are capable of. So on our side, we're very much involved there from the get-go and said, okay, if the bot framework was all about those primitives and event handlers and things of that nature, invoke patterns, how do we expand that to meet the moment of AI? And here in 2024, it's really to meet Microsoft's vision and structure of a modern Copilot, right? So this is our custom engine Copilots really is a story of history of evolving these chatbots to be more AI aware. And we kind of approached it from two ends of the tech stack. We had the conversational interface there with that bot framework. But what we lacked was underneath that interface, a strong point of view and good guidance for, hey, how do you attach a large language model to one of these things? How do you attach your data to that model? How do you build an orchestrator or a planner that can actually trigger actions in your business logic? What we saw as partners it was kind of like the early days of the internet where, before say like Ruby on Rails and other frameworks, people were just off building whatever, trying to get stuff onto this internet thing. People were doing that with AI. They were stringing all those things together and trying to build AI chatbots. So, for that bottom part of that tech stack, in October of last year, we actually launched the Teams AI library, which is an SDK that basically builds all those components and scaffolds them out for you. So that if you're somebody, say, that's trying to build a go-to-market AI-driven solution, you probably do have a large language model in mind. You probably do have a data set in mind and a planner and an orchestrator. All of these things are technologies that are maturing in front of us in this AI-driven space. So we put those same components in our library. Said, here's where you stick your model. Here's where you put your data. Here's where you put your orchestrator and planner. And at the end of it, click a button, and you have an experience in M365. So that's kind of how this has come so far.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, Microsoft has evolved a lot in its thinking around platform and the openness, I think, in the last 15 years, maybe 10 years, very much so. I was talking to someone the other day about the Satcher coming in as CEO, and very quickly Office arrived on the iPad as an example of that. But more recently, I think, in the way that you're tackling, you bring whatever orchestrator you want, bring whatever LLM you want to this game, I think is the right way to approach this with the industry, not just from a big software company, but also from like line of business developers wanting to build these things internally too. What types of LLM models are you seeing? And also then what orchestrators are you seeing as like common threads across the discussions you're having in the previews and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of folks at Microsoft, if they're deploying an M365 solution, they see a lot of value in using something that has the guardrails that M365 provides.
Yeah.
So we'll see a lot of people using Azure AI Studio or Azure OpenAI Studio. And that's where they'll be in their playground developing a model. And typically, those are OpenAI models, So most recently, GPT-4o. Before that, we saw a lot of momentum and partners using GPT 3.5, 3.5 Turbo. And even before that, some of the earlier GPT models. And so there's this idea of like, let's develop our model there. Let's make sure it's compliant, hosted in Azure there. Then let's apply this conversational interface with the AI library on top of that. And now we have this kind of Microsoft guardrailed solution. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of partners that are doing that. And, that works for them and their customers. But we're starting to see more and more partners that maybe view models as this kind of commoditized thing where they can evaluate on price and on use case and on benchmark metrics that are most useful for their function calls and their needs. And they're bringing other models in. You see Llama models being deployed more and more. And actually, one of the more interesting things I could say at the model layer is small language models, like Microsoft's Phi models. One of the things we do with custom copilots is the ability to sort of orchestrate across multiple models, actually, to perform the right need. So if a user expresses an intent for one thing that's maybe best suited for Model A, and for a follow-up intent for another thing that's best suited for Model B, you can actually kind of dynamically reach out to the right model at the right time and return the right result.
That's interesting.
When you're playing in that world, small language models are super compelling because they can be kind of fine-tuned and targeted for very specific use cases. And so, I think what we'll see in the enterprise is more and more of these Phi models taking hold, or other small language models. It's an exciting space to be. I think OpenAI is still kind of the prevailing answer, especially Azure OpenAI hosted solutions.
Yeah.
Seeing a lot there. Then at the orchestration layer, LangChain is a very popular kind of community built planner and sustained planner mechanism. But there's other Microsoft solutions as well that our own kind of semantic index and semantic planner teams have developed at Microsoft. And it's that same kind of thing. There are some customers who very much want to be in Microsoft's ecosystem and guardrails to make sure everything they're doing is compliant for their customers. There's other partners that are more open to a more modular, customized end-to-end solution.
Yeah.
And like I said, we built an SDK that says, you go ahead and tell us what pieces you want to plug in here. And at the end of the day, what we'll output is a conversational AI that we can use as a copilot here in M365.
And that means that technically the models don't have to live running on Azure resources. They can be living over in any cloud service that is running a model, right?
Yep, that's absolutely right.
Yeah. So, and then the other aspect that I think of choice that I noticed from speaking to you in the build session and so forth was just the languages. I think you just recently announced another language for the SDK or library. What kind of drove that? Like, because I think assuming you started off with .NET as the basis because of the bot framework and its history, but you evolved pretty quickly into the other languages over time, right?
Yeah, that was big for us. We actually started with JavaScript,
Okay.
and then added .NET, and a lot of that was from early partner feedback. When we were incubating this thing and building this library, we were building it back at a time where it wasn't clear to us what all those components that I rattled off at the top of my head now in 2024. In 2022, I was still learning what a planner and an orchestrator and all these things were and how they worked. And so working directly with partners that said, hey, we're forward thinking a little bit here. We have AI in our backlog. We need you to tell us how to light this up in Microsoft clients. Those are the partners we tactically identified and said, hey, help us define what those components you need are to make this library useful to you. And B, what languages are you writing in?
Yeah.
So with those early customers, there was a lot of enthusiasm, and continues to be for .NET, for JavaScript. But then as we got this thing out the door, and it was less about a private preview where we were working directly with the customers who were helping us test this out and providing feedback and so on. And when we made it generally available and started talking to the public about this, it became very clear that Python, which is the new language you just referred to that we launched at Build, Python is kind of this prevailing scripting language that these AI go-to-market customers favor. So if you're somebody starting a startup or starting a product in a bigger company, and the point of it is to generate an AI chatbot for all intents and purposes, those customers, by and large, a huge swath of them are programming in Python. So we wanted to make sure we were meeting the community where they were, and we launched that. So we have Python, JavaScript, and .NET versions of the Teams AI library available today.
That's awesome. And the Teams AI library is just an extension in Visual Studio Code. Anyone can go grab it, pull it in, and get started, right?
Yep. Easiest way to do it is to use Visual Studio Code's Teams Toolkit. There's a ton of samples and scaffolding available there. In fact, I think you can open a new project and choose Custom Copilot as one of your options. And the library just under the hood gets imported, scaffolds out a Hello World project for you. And you can really start to see, how you can tweak that to meet your business goals. But in addition to that, for those that are more interested in the underlying library at large, it's all open source. So we take a ton of contributions from the community. We see a lot of people forking this thing off. And on top of it, like I mentioned earlier, it's all built on top of our bot framework. And the importance there is to say the strategy is we're modernizing that bot framework, meeting the moment, trying to understand what are all the core elements of a Copilot. Let's bring what we have to that. Because what we have are a lot of the fundamentals that you need for any conversational experience. So things like, respecting the like data isolation policies by any type of organization, or data resiliency, chat resiliency, regionality. When you build on the bot framework and you deploy your solution, we respect all the kind of regionality that is required for, say, EUDB requirements and such in Teams. All those fundamental aspects came with it, and that was a huge, compelling reason to modernize that stack.
Whereabouts does the bot framework live in terms of ownership in Microsoft these days? Who's driving the engineering of that?
The cool news is, Teams, because we took such a bet on it and built our AI library on it, we contribute quite a bit to it. But we're also working hand in hand with the Copilot Studio team. So if you're unaware, Copilot Studio is an awesome tool for building copilots, and it can help low-code developers all the way up to pro-code developers just kind of assemble both custom engine copilots that we're talking about today, as well as declarative copilots, which is, I think, a topic for another conversation. I think you had one last week with Sebastien.
Yeah, that's right.
And so it's a tool for both. But under the hood, a lot of what they lean on, the same type of protocols down there. So they're maintaining it as well, working kind of across the org there. And what you can be assured of is that, these two teams are investing in that type of architecture and infrastructure long term. So the bot framework itself, I'll say, was kind of in more of like a long-term maintenance mode a handful of years back. We were saying, let's make sure we're stable. But again, we're going to stop with the primitives and stabilize those. And that's our story. Again, AI changed all that, put a new fire kind of under that and resulted in the AI library that we have today.
And how do you think the fundamentals of talking to a bot 5 years ago, which seems insane to say that, with these commands to now with the natural language conversation with essentially a copilot and not a bot as we're framing things. Mm-hmm. What's the experience differences on an end user other than what we already mentioned around like the commanding of I'm not having to remember the exact text string to give it for it to work? Like what other experience things have evolved in teams and how that's improved what that is for ISVs and customers?
Yeah. I mean, again, the difference from 5 years ago, like you said, and by the way, that's 2019, which breaks my brain. But 5 years ago, in addition to the kind of what a bot can do, rudimentary commands, then now the expectation is natural conversation.
Yeah.
That's all kind of that switch, the switch from commands to natural conversation. That's everything I've talked about so far, the model, the orchestrator, everything the library can evolve.
Yeah.
But we've also significantly invested on the top of that tech stack as well to say, the other half of the bones of a Copilot at Microsoft, if we're defining a standard for custom engine Copilots, it has to include both all of those underlying infrastructure elements as well as UI, UX elements, interaction patterns that users would expect for any modern Copilot. So these are aspects like adding citations to any given response so you can see where that response came from, the data source for something like that. Labels, sensitivity labels on an individual message basis. Super important nuance there is, you might send a message that the AI entirely generated because that was the right thing to do. Maybe somebody wanted help drafting an email or something, and your Copilot helped them do that in your own unique way. You might want to put a label on that says, hey, look, the model and the AI came up with this message. But there's other messages that you can control in your custom Copilot that aren't actually entirely driven by AI. Maybe you're returning a adaptive card that has business or sales data in it. Well, that data isn't made up. That was maybe pulled directly from your database and was included verbatim in the response. Well, you wouldn't want an AI sensitivity label on that says, hey, this thing might be made up. You actually are sure that your custom Copilot is returning the right business result in that instance. So that kind of flexibility at a per message level, something we've also built in. We're also adding components like feedback loops on any given message. So if you've seen in Copilot the thumbs up, thumbs down kind of paradigm, it's now included with custom engine Copilots.
So you you provide the hooks that then a developer's API can trigger based on the UI pushing the thumbs up, thumbs down.
That's exactly right.
That's really cool.
Get an event that gives a positive or negative reaction, and even optionally, you can include a user's ability to write a message in the feedback event itself. So the user will get a little text dialogue to say what went right or wrong. And now as a developer, you have all that telemetry at your disposal to adjust your experience accordingly. And then perhaps the biggest UX investment, which is still rolling out and will be available very shortly in public preview, is available in private preview now, is streaming UX. So this is basically the ChatGPT or Copilot style UX of returning every token as the model presents it in its response.
Oh, so rather than waiting for the whole payload and rendering, it's kind of doing it as it goes.
That's right. And waiting for that whole payload can take a long time. But when you add streaming, that first token, when it's ready, can be available to your users. So that perceived latency goes way down. It might take 15 seconds to finish, but they're reading it as it's being written, and it feels instant. It's a really good way to kind of adjust for perceived latency. We also have total control over that streaming as well. So a big ethos with custom engine Copilots in general is to start to define everything I've talked about, the elements of a Copilot, but within those elements, give developers control over how they function. So with streaming, we have some developers who are comfortable in some responses with streaming every token as it's returned, a token being a couple characters at a time. We have other developers who say, hey, for this response, I'm not comfortable streaming a couple characters at a time. I have RAI guidelines. I have moderation checks I'd like to place. So what we let them do is batch those tokens together to a long enough token that they can maybe validate and moderate, and then return that bigger batch and chunk. So basically the end user experience would be something like seeing almost a sentence by sentence assembly of a response. That flexibility is all there with this protocol, which again will be publicly available in a few weeks.
So, and essentially when you're talking about this is all within the Teams user experience, whether you're on a Mac, Windows, or a mobile device, like that's going to give you that same experience in having this conversation with a Copilot.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
So I guess, my PM brain goes, wow, like you're going to have to keep real close to the industry on how the Copilot user experience adapts over time. Like the thumbs up, thumbs down. I think I'd seen it in OpenAPI Premium a while back. And then obviously we did some work in Copilot for Microsoft 365 to evolve that. And then I saw it coming up in your custom engine Copilot stuff within Teams. I guess you've got one train that's try and be as relevant as possible there with what they're doing in other UIs if they're hosting their Copilot in their own UI, and making sure Teams stays as close to their own experience as possible. But then you've also got the flip side then of like, how can I make this really valuable to be in Teams and not just be iframing someone's Copilot into Teams? How are you balancing that? And what things have surprised you along the way that has, increased engagement, or you've had a customer, drop the mic moment when you've shown them something?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, because there is a balance here, which is, Copilot is its own product with its own kind of interaction patterns that are being developed to meet the moment for Copilot. And Teams is obviously an evolved product to allow people to have communications and conversations with one another, with chats, right, with channels, with meetings, right? And each should be similar. They're both conversational experiences, but there's intentionally divergent user experiences in those landscapes. So now when we're talking about a custom engine Copilot that's running in Teams, do we favor the human kind of centric Teams style UI and UX interfaces? Or do we say, hey, people are going to expect more and more Copilot style interactions and interface? And maybe do we build more of those? Streaming actually is a great example. We don't stream every keystroke that you type when you type a message to me in Teams, but we do so now for bots. So that balance has been super interesting to strike. One thing that we've really been intentional about is working with, one advantage of working at Microsoft is we can work across a wide swath of organizational lines where people are coming together to start to define what a Copilot is, what those UI elements are expected for any modern Copilot. We definitely want any custom engine Copilot to follow those patterns. Mm-hmm. So we have a seat at that table where we're learning things like the thumbs up, thumbs down paradigm is an expectation. Great. We'll take that in. We'll go build it into our platform.
Citations or other ones, right? Like
citations, all that kind of stuff. We'll maintain that. At the same time, we have another seat at another table with Teams. Teams itself is evolving. We want to make sure that these custom engine Copilots aren't just sitting somewhere else, but they can also play in those spaces. So I think what you'll see is this dichotomy a little bit of personal interactions with Copilots will look and feel a lot like, with custom engine Copilots will look and feel a lot like your personal interaction with Copilot. But these things can also run in Teams meetings, and they can run in Teams group chats. And when they run there, the look and feel of that experience will feel a lot more like talking with human beings. More and more, our group experiences will be participants, and they might be humans and they might be Copilots. And you should be able to kind of talk with both of them in the same fashion. And the work that we're doing on the platform is to try to abstract that difference as much as possible. A developer writes one functionality for an experience, and we render it the right way at the right time for our users in M365. That's actually a huge advantage you get building an M365 is, our clients will kind of position this to fit these methods and modes. You don't have to stitch that together on your own as a developer. And I would say one of the big, you asked what was a drop the mic or light bulb moment or something along those lines. I think for us, it's really been around the expansion of, I would say, I don't know if context size is the right way to put it, but the expansion of data that I've seen come into custom Copilots being made. So there are SaaS apps that have existed for some time who have data, some in an organized database, some in random documents, some in SharePoint locations. And the way that our middle kind of data layers with Azure AI Search, with Graph, with vectorized databases, the way those are being attached into Copilot experiences in a real bespoke way to meet users where they are when people talk to them has been night and day since even when we launched AI Library about a year ago. And I just can see that continuing to expand, which is very exciting.
And how do you, this notion of the demo you did at Build with the voice integration as well, how have you found that? Like I think I can't remember exactly what the demo was because Build feels like an eternity ago now, and it was really only 3 months ago. But the demo you were doing was basically voice to do the mapping system that was a live share platform extension as well, right? Yep. How on earth did that come about as an idea, and how quickly could you turn that around as an entry hook between marrying custom engine copilots with that live share work?
Yeah, well, first of all, Build being 3 months ago, that feels like 3 years ago. And in 2019 being 5 years ago feels like 50. So that's this wonderful world of AI.
We're dancing the line of what we can talk about on this show and what we can't based on different events coming up, right?
But no, it was a really good call out there where this maybe dovetails a little bit to where we're headed with these custom engine copilots. Because then one thing we're really striving to do is to say, let's not relegate these things only to teams. Let's try to expand them across M365 so that wherever you're working and anticipate finding a custom engine copilot, you should see the copilot that you've built as a developer. So that's one thing we're working very closely on. Maybe we could talk more about that in a little bit. But another area, a couple areas we're seeing more and more momentum is while we're trying to do that, we're also trying to use the robustness of the Teams app model to its advantage. To say, hey, there's plenty of components in our app model in Teams that aren't really necessarily directly related to a copilot, but that a copilot could really supercharge. So one component we have is the ability to for your application to take over the meeting stage. So at Build, we showcased a couple of partners, one of which was showing basically complex 3D manufacturing models. Another one, ArcGIS, was working in topographical map information that we talked about at Build. The first one was Nexus by Hexagon. And so for those two partners, they were already building this meetings experience, like you mentioned, with live share technology. They also then, as a separate capability, started building their own custom engine copilots out of their existing bots. They were adding AI, they really evolved with us. The trick we did with them is we basically launched an experience that tells them that that's the same session, that the session where they're presenting their 3D model, for instance, if you're a Nexus Hexagon customer, it can be the same session that the Copilot is also running in live in the meetings chat. Thus, when people start talking to that Copilot in the meetings chat, it's intelligent enough to update the stage that's being shared. So the demo we actually shared was somebody said, hey, pull up this car part model. And the meeting stage, it updated, the car part model was there. It said, put on some tension hotspots under these conditions. Meeting stage updated, everyone saw that at the same time. Now people were collaborating together. Because our bots also support calling in video, we imagine that to be a huge investment going forward. We're calling that multimodality, which is, hey, ChatGPT started with text-based chat interactions,
right?
But they're not stopping there. And in Teams, we already have places where people are talking to each other with voice, with video, with screen sharing. How can we inject that as more layers of interaction? If what we built, when I mentioned the bot framework and the AI library is a conversational interface, well, how can we not stop at chat, but actually add interfaces for calling, live video, live transcript, live screen sharing, such that all of those can be inputs to the same engine orchestrator model to make intelligent suggestions. So this multimodality, is very exciting. It's definitely another direction and focus area for us.
Yeah, and I think I've been in platform most of my career, and that's the bit that I find exciting is like, essentially you're giving all these different Lego blocks for people to play with in certain ways. And just sometimes the creativity that comes out of this, where they come and show a demo and you're like, wow, okay, we weren't even thinking about that, but that's actually a really neat thing to go do.
Very
And
rewarding.
that one was definitely one of the
that.
build like demos I saw that week where I was like, okay, that's actually like not just a gimmick thing. Like people will, my brother's an architect. I showed it to him. He was like, oh my God, we would use this all the time with with the AutoCAD stuff we do. So tying it into platforms like Teams, which my brother uses as well, it's just a no-brainer to bring all this technology together. So I do like that. So from a Teams perspective, obviously being in Teams, that's where you've been focused. But with Copilot for Microsoft 365 and what we're doing with the Copilot for Microsoft 365, you're also playing in that space too. And there's things you've done in that space, which we've announced that are in private preview right now that will be in public preview shortly. We won't disclose a date on here, but sooner rather than later. What things will you see as hooks if you've already invested in Teams AI library and building your own custom engine Copilot inside of M365 Copilot?
Yeah. So if you view where we're at today, I'm glad I did the history lesson up front because it explains why where we're at today is where we're at today, which is we evolved bots, which ran in Teams, to become copilots. And we started to learn across Microsoft, what is a copilot? What does Microsoft expect? Streaming, citations, a large language model, everything we talked about today in the podcast. Okay, so if we've evolved bots to support all of those things, now we have these custom copilots in Teams. As you pointed out, it's very natural to say, well, why stop at Teams? There's a lot of customers that want to deploy these. We've heard for a long time, want to deploy these, say, to just their own web experiences. But maybe most intriguingly, most importantly, is can we start deploying these things to the copilots, the copilot surfaces that Microsoft offers outside of Teams? So Microsoft 365 Copilot, for instance. So now Copilot can kind of act as this hub for AI. It's where I go talk with the core Copilot experience itself. It's also where I find declarative copilots, which maybe I myself made or a colleague of mine made and shared with me that I'm using, something on those lines. But also these custom engine copilots that are totally customized from the whole stack's perspective. They should also appear there. And I should be able to be working kind of alongside each of them at any given time. So that's a huge area of investment for us. And the good news is, if I could have any call to action, it's that, yes, today, the Teams AI library is the Teams AI library, and the thing that you're outputting will work in Teams. But where you're setting yourself up going forward is that's the library we're really doubling down on investments to build anything that requires, or anything required, I should say, to bring those same custom engine copilots today in Teams across M365, including M365 Copilot. So you'll start to see more and more functionality light up there as we get closer to the public preview that you mentioned. And so good news is if you're making those investments, you'll see just additive investments to make all that happen. You won't have to kind of rewrite a whole nother experience for that same set of use cases, those same models and orchestrators and so on. No, we're going to share all of those layers as much as possible. Now, of course, like I just talked about, there's some nuance that Teams has, that Copilot has, and that are never going to be totally shared. So your Copilot will have to kind of account for that. Teams expects, things like group scopes. That's just unique to Teams, group chat. And M365 Copilot has its own uniqueness. So there'll be some work there, mostly kind of at that front end layer. But all those infrastructural layers, your orchestrator, your model, your triggers, your actions, all that kind of stuff, the idea is that's all going to be shared across each of these surfaces, which is really powerful because now this thing really starts to become a standard. It's not just Copilot, as Microsoft defines it, these copilots are as you define it too, as a developer.
Yeah, and so this notion of where with declarative copilots, and Seb talked about them showing up in M365 Copilot as well as in Teams.
Yep.
In the switch, a custom engine Copilot will be in Teams, but it'll also show up in the M365 Copilot services as well. And there's work for it to show up in M365 Copilot shows right now in Teams and office.com/chat, but it will also start to show in what we call internally app chat, which is a kind of like Outlook, Word, PowerPoint, Excel. And,
right.
And I think that'll be nice that, whether it's a custom engine one or a declarative one, those copilots will live and breathe and be interacted by in multiple hubs within the M365 platform.
It's totally right. The call to action to our developer community is you should really consider building a Copilot for Microsoft. Like you just mentioned, there's two very compelling options, today. You have declarative copilots You have custom engine copilots that we talked about. You can consider how each of those works, make the right decision for you as a partner. But the good news is for our end users, the people interacting with these things, they don't know the difference between any of this stuff.
They don't need to know, right? Like if to them, they're just going to mention them and talk to them, and the implementation details are completely hidden. And that's, I think, been a great goal in being on these design sessions of trying to remove that aspect of it for the end user.
That's exactly right. Trying to meet them where they are, meet them with concepts that they know. To them, they're all copilots. They know what each of them do. They want to find them wherever they're working and use them. And so that's really where it's very much this kind of year of building consistency and stability across those different surfaces for this concept of a copilot, which is really exciting stuff.
That's awesome. Well, look, I want to keep promise on time. Thank you so much for coming on the show again. If you're listening and you've loved what you've heard here, Joey and John did an incredible session at Build. I'll make sure it's in the show notes. It had an obscure name though, didn't it? I think the title affected you a little bit on how many people turn up in person.
Well, what you learned is how far these things reach, which is 320 plus million people on Teams. But that's what you'll have to look for in our build title. But as you mentioned, you want any kind of level of detail. We go through how to make one of these things from what they are to one fully functional by the end of it.
Man, I was ready to sign on the dotted line at the end of that session. You did such a good job with it. It was super impressive.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, well, we'll have to get you on once the new updates come out, post some of these major events. But I hope this gives everyone a good primer on what they are now that Copilot is in the world as well as Teams. So thanks again, mate. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited. 1 year exactly to the day. I'll be back on the show.
Exactly.
Annual cadence.
Thanks very much, man.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Microsoft 365 Dev Podcast. Check out our show notes on www.m365devpodcast.com and follow us on X at M365devpodcast. We'd really appreciate it if you could give us a review on Apple Podcasts too. That's all, folks.